You're replaceable. Never forget that. The words hung in the air like poison, delivered with the same casual tone Evelyn Creed might use to order her morning latte. Tobias stood frozen in the doorway of their Miami penthouse, watching his wife of 5 years lean back in, her silk robe, phone pressed to her ear, speaking to another man with an intimacy she had never shown him. Tobias Creed had built an empire from absolutely nothing. At 38, he commanded one of Miami's most prestigious luxury real estate firms, turning abandoned lots into billion-dollar developments. His name appeared on Forbes lists. His handshake closed deals worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. Power, wealth, influence. He possessed them all, but standing there, invisible in his own home, he felt smaller than the day. He'd started with nothing but a borrowed suit and relentless ambition. Evelyn finally noticed him. Their eyes met through the reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking Biscayne Bay. She didn't flinch, didn't end the call. Instead, she smiled, cold, calculated, victorious. "Marcus, darling, I'll call you back," she purred into the phone, never breaking eye contact with her husband. "Something just walked in that needs my attention." The dismissal cut deeper than any blade. Tobias had endured 5 years of emotional starvation, convinced that his love could eventually thaw the ice around Evelyn's heart. He'd showered her with everything money could buy, private jets to Paris, front row seats at Fashion Week, a closet worth more than most people's homes. None of it mattered. Evelyn rose from the Italian leather chair, her movements deliberate and predatory. At 34, she remained breathtaking, the kind of woman who stopped traffic and commanded attention simply by existing. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her green eyes held the same calculating gleam that had first attracted him at a corporate gala 5 years ago. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked, though her tone suggested she didn't particularly care about the answer. "Long enough," Tobias replied, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. She laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or remorse. "Oh, please, don't look so wounded. We both know this marriage has been a performance for years." The casual cruelty in her voice revealed everything. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a mistake born from loneliness. This was who Evelyn truly was, a woman who viewed relationships as transactions and people as assets to be leveraged or discarded. 5 years, Evelyn. 5 years I've tried to make this work. And I've played my part beautifully, she shot back, moving to the bar cart and pouring herself a glass of champagne. The perfect wife for your perfect image. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to pretend you're enough for someone like me? The words landed like physical blows. Tobias had always known Evelyn was out of his league in conventional terms. She was a former model turned high society consultant who made millionaires look like royalty. But he'd believed that his consistency, his devotion, his unwavering commitment would eventually matter more than surface attractions. He'd been wrong. "Who is he?" Tobias asked, though part of him didn't want to know. "Does it matter? There have been others. There will be others." Evelyn sipped her champagne, studying him like a scientist observing a lab rat. "You're a good man, Tobias. Reliable, successful. But you're also predictable, safe. And I've never been attracted to safe." The admission should have destroyed him. Instead, something unexpected happened. The fog of self-doubt that had clouded his judgment for years began to lift. For the first time, he saw their relationship with perfect clarity. Evelyn had never loved him. She'd loved what he represented: security, status, a carefully curated lifestyle. But she'd never loved the man who worked 18-hour days to build something meaningful, who remembered her coffee order and the anniversary of her mother's death, who'd held her through panic attacks she'd never thanked him for. "You're right," he said quietly, surprising them both. "I am predictable. I show up. I keep my promises. I treat people with respect. If that makes me boring in your eyes, then we want different things." Evelyn's expression shifted slightly. She'd expected anger, pleading, perhaps even violence. She hadn't expected acceptance. "What's that supposed to mean?" Tobias walked to his home office, pulled out a manila folder he'd hoped never to use, and returned to the living room. Evelyn's eyes widened as she recognized the divorce papers he'd had drawn up a year ago but never filed. "It means you're right about one thing. This marriage has been a performance. But the show's over." For the first time since he'd known her, Evelyn looked genuinely rattled. "You can't be serious." Over one phone call, over 5 years of phone calls. 5 years of feeling like a stranger in my own home. 5 years of loving someone who sees me as replaceable. He set the papers on the marble coffee table between them. Well, congratulations. You're about to find out just how replaceable I am. The color drained from Aveline's face as the reality of the situation hit her. She'd pushed too far, revealed too much, assumed her beauty and his devotion would always be enough to keep him tethered to her cruelty. Tobias, wait. Let's talk about this rationally. We just did. He headed toward the door, pausing only to look back at the woman who'd consumed 5 years of his life. I'll be staying elsewhere tonight. My attorney will contact you in the morning. As he walked out of the penthouse, Tobias felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Relief. The weight of trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it lifted from his shoulders. The fear of being alone paled in comparison to the exhaustion of being lonely while married. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoyed the story. That night, sitting in a hotel room overlooking the same bay he'd shared with Aveline, Tobias made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't just ending a marriage, he was reclaiming his life. The man who'd built an empire from nothing was about to discover that sometimes the most powerful thing you can build is the courage to walk away. The Fontainebleau Miami Beach buzzed with the energy of South Florida's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over designer gowns and tailored tuxedos as Miami's most influential gathered for the annual Coastal Development Summit. Tobias Creed stood near the bar, nursing a whiskey and observing the crowd with the analytical eye that had made him millions. At 33, he'd already transformed Miami's skyline with 3 luxury developments, but tonight felt different. He'd been invited not as an up-and-coming developer, but as an established power player. The recognition should have satisfied him, yet something felt hollow about celebrating alone. That's when she walked in. Aveline Moreau commanded attention without trying. Her midnight blue gown hugged her curves perfectly, and her confident stride suggested she owned every room she entered. Conversations paused as heads turned to follow her movement across the marble floor. She wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. "You're staring," said Richard Blackstone, Tobias's mentor and the evening's keynote speaker. "Hard not to," Tobias admitted, watching Aveline accept a champagne flute from a waiter who seemed mesmerized by her smile. Aveline Moreau, brand consultant to the wealthy and famous. She's the one who transformed Senator Williams from a political nobody into presidential material. Word is, she can make anyone look like royalty. Tobias studied her more carefully. She moved through the crowd with purpose, engaging in brief conversations that left people leaning in, hanging on her words. There was something calculated about her charm, but it was undeniably effective. "Introduce me," Tobias said. Richard raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? Aveline's got a reputation for being selective. I didn't build my company by playing it safe." 20 minutes later, Tobias found himself face to face with the most captivating woman he'd ever encountered. Up close, Aveline's green eyes held depths that seemed to promise secrets worth discovering. "Mr. Creed," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I've been following your work. The Meridian Towers project was brilliant, turning that abandoned warehouse district into luxury living. Very impressive." Her knowledge of his projects caught him off guard. Most people at these events knew his name but little about his actual work. "Thank you. Richard tells me you're the genius behind Senator Williams' transformation." Aveline's laugh was musical, genuine. Genius might be overstating it. I simply helped him present his best self to the world. Image is everything in politics and business. They talked for an hour, moving from the crowded ballroom to a quieter terrace overlooking the ocean. Aveline was brilliant, well-traveled, and surprisingly knowledgeable about architecture and urban development. She'd grown up in New Orleans, studied at Columbia, and built her consulting firm from scratch, a self-made success story that matched his own. "Most people see luxury real estate as just expensive buildings," she said, leaning against the railing as ocean breeze played with her hair. "But you understand, it's about creating experiences, selling dreams." "Exactly. Anyone can build a building, creating a lifestyle, a status symbol. That's the real art." Their connection felt electric, immediate. When Aveline mentioned she was flying to New York the next morning for a client meeting, Tobias surprised himself by offering his private jet. "That's very generous," she said, studying his face. "But I barely know you." "Then let's fix that. Dinner tomorrow night? I know a place in Soho that serves the best seafood outside of New Orleans." She smiled, the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her all evening. "I'd like that." The next 6 months became a whirlwind of private dinners, weekend getaways, and red carpet appearances. Evelyn fit seamlessly into Tobias's world, elevating every event with her presence. She had opinions about his business decisions, suggestions for his wardrobe, ideas for expanding his social circle. "You need to be seen with the right people," she'd say, adjusting his tie before a charity gala. "Success isn't just about what you accomplish. It's about who witnesses your accomplishments." The media loved them. Miami's power couple graced the covers of lifestyle magazines. Society photographers captured their every public appearance. Aveline orchestrated their image with the same precision she brought to her clients' campaigns. "We look good together," she'd say, reviewing photos from their latest event. "Very good." Tobias found himself changing to match her vision. His conservative suits gave way to more fashionable cuts. His modest downtown condo was replaced by a sprawling penthouse in Brickell. His small circle of close friends expanded to include Aveline's network of influencers, socialites, and power brokers. The proposal came during a weekend in the Hamptons. Tobias had planned something intimate, a sunset walk on the beach, just the two of them. But Aveline had invited friends to join them at the house, turning the moment into a performance. When he dropped to one knee with a 5-carat diamond ring, Aveline's gasp seemed perfectly timed. The assembled crowd erupted in applause as she said yes, tears streaming down her cheeks in a display that would look stunning in the inevitable magazine spread. "This is perfect," she whispered in his ear as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "Absolutely perfect." The wedding 6 months later was Miami's social event of the year. 300 guests, a waterfront venue, and enough flowers to stock a botanical garden. Aveline looked radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown, every detail orchestrated to perfection. Standing at the altar, watching his bride walk down the aisle, Tobias felt like the luckiest man alive. Aveline had chosen him, successful, driven Tobias Creed, over all the other wealthy, powerful men who'd pursued her. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant announced. As their lips met, cameras flashed and guests cheered. It was everything Aveline had envisioned, beautiful, elegant, unforgettable. What Tobias didn't notice was how quickly Aveline's smile faded once the cameras stopped rolling, or how her eyes scanned the crowd during their first dance, already calculating her next move. The honeymoon in Santorini was picture perfect, their social media feeds filled with sunset photos and romantic dinners. But even then, subtle signs emerged. Aveline spent hours each day on calls with clients, managing crises and building her brand. When Tobias suggested they turn off their phones for one evening, she looked at him like he'd suggested they burn money. "This is who I am, Tobias," she said, not unkindly. "I thought you understood that." He did understand, or thought he did. Success required sacrifice, and Aveline's drive was part of what attracted him. He just hadn't realized how little space that drive would leave for them. The first crack appeared 3 months after the honeymoon, during what should have been a celebration. Tobias had just closed the biggest deal of his career, a $200 million mixed-use development in Coral Gables that would cement his reputation as Miami's premier luxury developer. He rushed home to share the news, champagne in hand, expecting to find his wife as excited as he was. Instead, he found Aveline in their home office, surrounded by fabric samples and mood boards for a client's penthouse renovation. "Guess what just happened?" he said, setting the champagne on her desk with a grin. Aveline glanced up briefly, her attention still focused on the color swatches in her hands. "The Coral Gables project? Richard called an hour ago to congratulate me on landing such a successful husband." The casual dismissal stung. This wasn't just any deal. It was the culmination of 2 years of negotiations, the project that would establish his firm as a major player in South Florida development. "That's it? That's your reaction? What do you want me to say, Tobias? Congratulations? I'm proud of you?" She finally looked up, her expression mildly annoyed. "Of course I'm pleased. Your success reflects well on both of us. But I have my own deadlines to meet." He opened the champagne anyway, pouring 2 glasses. Aveline accepted hers but didn't toast. instead returning to her work while he stood there feeling foolish for expecting more. That night, lying in bed beside his wife who was scrolling through her phone, Tobias realized he couldn't remember the last time Eveline had asked about his day without relating it back to her own interests. The pattern became more obvious once he started noticing it. Aveline's world revolved around Aveline. His achievements mattered only insofar as they enhanced her status. His feelings were valid only when they aligned with her needs. "We need to attend the Morrison Charity Gala next week," she announced over breakfast one morning, not looking up from her tablet where she was reviewing event photos from the previous night. "I can't. I'm flying to Atlanta to meet with potential investors. Reschedule it." "Aveline, this meeting took months to arrange. These investors could fund my next 3 projects." She finally looked at him, her green eyes cold. "And the Morrison Gala could introduce me to the governor's wife, who's looking for someone to manage her public image during his re-election campaign. Which do you think is more important?" The question hung between them like a challenge. In Aveline's mind, there was only one correct answer. Her career always took precedence. "They're both important," Tobias said carefully, "but I made this commitment first." "Fine." The word came out clipped, final. "I'll go alone." Again. She made it sound like he was constantly abandoning her, when the truth was quite the opposite. Tobias had rearranged his schedule countless times to accommodate her social calendar, often at significant cost to his business relationships. The emotional distance grew wider with each passing month. Eveline became increasingly critical of things that had never bothered her before. His laugh was too loud at dinner parties. His choice of wine wasn't sophisticated enough for their guests. His stories about construction challenges bored people. "You need to be more aware of your audience," she said, after a particularly tense dinner with her clients. "Not everyone finds foundation problems fascinating. I was just making conversation. You were dominating the conversation. There's a difference." These corrections came frequently now, always delivered with the same patient tone she might use with a slow child. Tobias found himself second-guessing every word, every gesture, every decision. The bedroom became another battleground, though the war was fought through absence rather than conflict. Eveline was always too tired, too stressed, too busy preparing for the next day's meetings. Physical intimacy became scheduled, perfunctory, something to be endured rather than enjoyed. "We should probably make an effort tonight," she'd say, as if discussing a dental appointment. It's been a while. Even their conversations about starting a family revealed the growing chasm between them. Tobias wanted children, had always envisioned a house filled with laughter and chaos. Aveline saw pregnancy as a career obstacle. "Maybe in a few years," she'd say whenever he brought it up. "Once my business is more established." But her business was thriving. She'd landed 3 high-profile political campaigns and was being courted by A-list celebrities seeking image makeovers. Success only made her hungrier for more success, leaving less room for anything or anyone else. The social events that had once brought them together became performances, where Tobias felt like a supporting actor in Aveline's one-woman show. She'd position them strategically for photos, coach him on talking points, and critique his performance afterward. "You seemed distracted tonight," she'd say during the car ride home. "Senator Martinez was trying to connect with you about the waterfront development, and you barely engaged." "I was tired. It's been a long week." "We can't afford to be tired at these events, Tobias. Every conversation is an opportunity." He began to dread the galas, the charity auctions, the private dinners that filled their social calendar. What had once felt like shared experiences now felt like work, unpaid work, where his only job was to make Eveline look good. Friends started commenting on the change in their dynamic. Richard Blackstone pulled him aside after a particularly awkward dinner party, where Aveline had corrected Tobias 3 times in front of their guests. "Everything okay at home?" Richard asked. "Of course. Why? You just seem different, less confident. That's not like you." Tobias wanted to defend his marriage, to insist everything was fine, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain that the woman he'd married was slowly erasing the man he'd been? The final straw came during their 2nd anniversary dinner. Tobias had made reservations at the restaurant where they'd had their first date, hoping to recapture some of the magic from their early days together. Aveline spent the entire meal on her phone, managing a crisis for a client whose scandal had just broken. She barely touched her food, barely acknowledged the anniversary gift he did carefully chosen, a first edition of her favorite book from college. "This is important, Tobias," she said when he finally asked her to put the phone away. "My client's entire career is on the line. And our marriage? What about that?" She looked at him with genuine confusion, as if the question made no sense. "Our marriage is fine. We're both successful. We look good together. We have a beautiful home. What more do you want?" Love, he thought but didn't say. Connection, partnership, a wife who sees me as more than an accessory to her ambitions. Instead, he smiled and finished his dinner in silence, already knowing their marriage was over. He just didn't know how to end it yet. By their 3rd year of marriage, Tobias had become a master of pretense. He smiled at the right moments, laughed at Aveline's carefully timed jokes during dinner parties, and played the role of devoted husband with Oscar-worthy precision. But inside, he was drowning. The breaking point began with small discoveries that accumulated like drops of poison in his bloodstream. Aveline's phone, once casually left on counters and tables, now remained permanently attached to her hand. Her business trips increased in frequency and duration, often to cities where Tobias knew she had no clients. "I'm expanding into the West Coast market," she explained, when he questioned a week-long trip to Los Angeles. "These relationships take time to cultivate." He wanted to believe her, desperately. The alternative was too devastating to contemplate. So he threw himself into his work with renewed intensity, using 18-hour days as an escape from the growing emptiness at home. The Meridian Bay project became his obsession, a $300 million luxury resort that would be his masterpiece. He spent weeks in the Florida Keys, overseeing every detail of the construction, grateful for the distance from Miami and the suffocating atmosphere of his marriage. During one of these trips, his assistant Jennifer called with an urgent question about permit approvals. In the background, he could hear the familiar sound of Aveline's laughter echoing through their penthouse. "Is my wife there?" he asked, confused. Aveline had told him she was in New York for a client meeting. "Oh, yes, sir. She's been here most of the afternoon with a gentleman. Should I tell her you called?" The lie hit him like a physical blow. Aveline wasn't in New York. She was in their home, entertaining another man while her husband worked 200 miles away. "No," Tobias managed. "Don't mention it." He drove back to Miami that night, arriving at 2 a.m. to find the penthouse empty except for Aveline, who was asleep in their bed wearing a silk nightgown he'd never seen before. The scent of unfamiliar cologne lingered in the living room. "You're back early," she said the next morning, her tone carefully neutral, as she prepared her usual breakfast of Greek yogurt and berries, finished ahead of schedule. "How was New York?" "Productive. Very productive." She didn't meet his eyes, focusing instead on her phone as she scrolled through emails. "The client is thrilled with the preliminary concepts." The ease with which she lied was almost impressive. No hesitation, no tells, just smooth deception delivered with the same confidence she brought to everything else. Tobias began paying attention to details he'd previously ignored. The new jewelry that appeared without explanation, the designer clothes she claimed were gifts from grateful clients, the way she showered immediately upon returning from her mysterious meetings. He hired a private investigator, a decision that made him feel both justified and disgusted with himself. Marcus Chen was discreet, professional, and devastatingly thorough. Within 2 weeks, he'd documented Aveline's affair with Dr. Sebastian Reyes, a prominent plastic surgeon who catered to Miami's elite. The photos were clinical in their clarity. Aveline and Sebastian entering his Coconut Grove mansion. Aveline leaving the next morning, wearing the same clothes from the night before. Aveline and Sebastian sharing intimate dinners at restaurants Tobias had never heard of. But the most damaging evidence wasn't visual, it was audio. Marcus had recorded a conversation between Aveline and her best friend Claudia during lunch at their usual spot in South Beach. "How long can you keep this up?" Claudia asked. "As long as I need to," Aveline replied, her voice carrying clearly through the recording device. Tobias provides stability and status. Sebastian provides excitement and passion. Why should I have to choose? What if Tobias finds out? He won't. He's too busy building his empire to notice what's happening in his own home. And even if he did, what's he going to do? Divorce me? He'd lose half of everything he's worked for. The casual cruelty in her voice was worse than any physical betrayal. She wasn't just cheating, she was calculating, using both men for different purposes while feeling entitled to both. Besides, Aveline continued, Tobias is safe, predictable. He'll never leave me because he's too afraid of being alone. Men like him need women like me to feel complete. Tobias listened to the recording 3 times before he could process what he'd heard. The woman he'd loved, married, and built a life with saw him as a convenience. A reliable source of security and status, nothing more. The next few months became an exercise in emotional survival. Tobias maintained the facade of their marriage while quietly preparing for its end. He consulted with divorce attorneys, restructured his business assets, and documented every instance of Aveline's deception. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal, it was the realization of how completely he'd lost himself in trying to please someone who was incapable of being pleased. He'd changed his clothes, his friends, his interests, even his personality to match Aveline's vision of the perfect husband, and none of it had mattered. You seem distant lately, Aveline observed one evening as they prepared for another charity gala. She was adjusting his tie with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything else. Just tired. The Meridian Bay project is demanding, well, try to be more present tonight. The Hendersons are considering a major renovation, and I want them to see us as the power couple they should aspire to be. Even now, facing him in their bedroom mirror, she saw him only as a prop in her carefully constructed image. The man behind the facade, his dreams, his pain, his growing desperation, remained invisible to her. That night, watching Aveline work the room with her usual charm, Tobias felt like a ghost haunting his own life. She introduced him to potential clients with practiced enthusiasm, her hand resting possessively on his arm while her eyes scanned the crowd for more important connections. "Isn't he wonderful?" she said to Mrs. Henderson, squeezing Tobias's arm. "So successful, so dedicated. I'm the luckiest woman in Miami." The performance was flawless, as always, but Tobias could see through it now, the calculated smiles, the strategic touches, the way she positioned them for maximum visual impact. Their entire marriage had become a marketing campaign for Aveline's brand. Standing there in his tuxedo, playing his assigned role, Tobias made a decision. He was done being a supporting character in someone else's story. The only question was when and how to make his exit. The answer would come sooner than he expected. The Turks and Caicos site inspection was supposed to take 3 days. Tobias had flown out on Monday morning to review the progress on his latest luxury resort development, expecting to return Thursday evening. But the contractor had exceeded expectations, completing the foundation work ahead of schedule, and the structural engineer had arrived early for his assessment. By Wednesday afternoon, Tobias found himself boarding his private jet back to Miami, eager to surprise Aveline with an early return. They'd barely spoken during his trip, just a few brief text exchanges about his flight details and her busy schedule with clients. He'd even picked up the emerald earrings she'd admired in a Turks and Caicos boutique, thinking they might spark some genuine warmth between them. The penthouse was quiet when he entered through the private elevator at 4:30 p.m. Aveline's Maserati was in the garage, so he knew she was home. Her assistant had mentioned she was taking calls from the home office that afternoon, working on a crisis management strategy for a client whose political campaign was imploding. Tobias set down his luggage quietly, planning to surprise her. The sound of her voice drifted from the living room, animated, flirtatious. Completely different from the professional tone she used with clients. "You're absolutely wicked," she was saying, followed by a laugh that made Tobias's stomach clench. He'd heard that laugh before, years ago, when they were dating, and she was genuinely happy. He hadn't heard it directed at him in over 2 years. Moving silently across the marble foyer, Tobias approached the living room entrance. What he saw stopped him cold. Aveline reclined on their white Italian leather sofa, wearing nothing but a silk robe that had fallen open to reveal far more than any business call would require. Her laptop was positioned on the coffee table, angled so the camera captured her most flattering pose. On the screen, Tobias could see a man he recognized, Dr. Sebastian Reyes, the plastic surgeon whose name had appeared frequently in Aveline's social media posts lately. "I can't stop thinking about last weekend," Sebastian's voice carried clearly through the laptop speakers. When can we do that again? Soon, Aveline purred, adjusting her robe to reveal even more skin. Very soon. Tobias is out of town until Thursdays, so we have time to plan something special. Tobias felt the world tilt beneath his feet. This wasn't just an affair, it was a relationship. The intimacy in their voices, the casual way they discussed their future plans, the complete absence of guilt or hesitation. This had been going on for months, possibly years. What about your husband? Sebastian asked. Doesn't he suspect anything? Aveline's laugh was sharp, dismissive. Tobias? Please. He's so buried in his construction projects he barely notices I exist. And even if he did, what's he going to do about it? He needs me more than I need him. The casual cruelty of her words hit Tobias like a physical blow. She wasn't just betraying him, she was mocking him, reducing their entire marriage to a joke she shared with her lover. You're terrible, Sebastian said, but his tone was admiring rather than critical. What did you tell him about the weekend in Key Largo? Client emergency. He bought it completely. He always does. Aveline stretched languidly, clearly enjoying the power she wielded over both men in her life. Tobias is wonderfully predictable that way. Show him a business crisis, and he'll believe anything. Tobias remembered that weekend. Aveline had claimed a client was having a public relations meltdown and needed immediate damage control. She'd left Friday morning and returned Sunday night, exhausted and stressed from putting out fires. He'd even ordered her favorite Thai food and drawn her a bath, wanting to help her relax after what he thought had been a difficult work crisis. The memory made him physically ill. I have something for you, Sebastian continued, and Tobias watched his wife's face light up with genuine excitement, an expression he hadn't seen directed at him in years. What is it? Aveline leaned closer to the camera, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. A little vacation. I've booked us a suite at the Ritz-Carlton in Sarasota for next weekend. Oceanfront, private balcony, room service, just you and me. That sounds perfect. What should I tell Tobias? Another client emergency? Too repetitive. I'll think of something more creative. Maybe a family crisis in New Orleans. He's always telling me I should visit my mother more often. They both laughed at this, sharing the joke of deceiving the man who paid for the penthouse they were defiling with their betrayal. Tobias felt something cold and final settle in his chest. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a mistake born from loneliness. This was calculated, ongoing, and completely without remorse. I should go, Sebastian said. I have surgery in an hour. But tonight, when you're lying next to your boring husband, think about me. I always do, Aveline replied, blowing a kiss at the camera. He's so dull in bed. No imagination, no passion. Just the same routine every time. You've ruined me for ordinary men. Tobias had heard enough. More than enough. He stepped back from the doorway, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd witnessed. This wasn't just adultery. It was emotional and psychological warfare. Aveline had been living a double life, using his love and trust as weapons against him while building a relationship with another man. The sound of the video call ending drifted from the living room, followed by Aveline's satisfied sigh. Tobias heard her moving around, probably getting dressed, preparing to resume her role as the dutiful wife when he returned from his trip. But he was already here, and everything had changed. Standing in his own foyer, surrounded by the luxury he'd worked 18-hour days to provide, Tobias felt like a stranger in his own life. The woman he'd loved, married, and sacrificed for saw him as nothing more than a convenient source of security and status. A boring, predictable man who deserved to be deceived because he was too trusting to see the truth. The emerald earrings in his jacket pocket felt like lead weights. He'd bought them thinking they might bridge the growing distance between them, never realizing that distance was intentional. Aveline didn't want to be closer to him. She wanted to be closer to Sebastian while keeping Tobias at arm's length, useful but unaware. The betrayal was complete, devastating, and apparently effortless for her. But as Tobias stood there processing the destruction of his marriage, he felt something unexpected alongside the pain: relief. Finally, he knew the truth. Finally, he could stop trying to fix something that had never been broken. It had been deliberately sabotaged from the inside. Tobias remained frozen in the foyer for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. His mind struggled to process the magnitude of what he'd witnessed, not just the betrayal, but the complete absence of guilt or remorse in Aveline's voice. She'd spoken about deceiving him, with the same casual tone she might use to discuss the weather. The sound of footsteps on marble snapped him back to reality. Aveline was moving through the penthouse, probably heading to the kitchen for her usual post-call green tea. He had seconds to decide how to handle this moment that would define the rest of his life. He could confront her immediately, demand explanations, fight for a marriage that had been dead longer than he'd realized. Or he could wait, gather more evidence, plan his response strategically. The businessman in him favored the latter approach, but the betrayed husband wanted answers now. The decision was made for him when Aveline appeared in the living room doorway, her silk robe now properly closed, her expression shifting from surprise to something that looked almost like annoyance. "You're back early," she said, her voice carefully neutral. No guilt, no panic, just mild irritation at having her schedule disrupted. "Finished ahead of schedule," Tobias replied, studying her face for any sign of the woman who'd been laughing with her lover minutes earlier. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just client calls. You know how it is." She moved past him toward the kitchen, her movements fluid and confident. "How was Turks and Caicos? Did the contractor stay on budget?" The casual normalcy of her questions was almost surreal. She was discussing his business trip while the laptop she'd used to plan, her next romantic getaway, still sat open on the coffee table behind her. "Everything went smoothly," he said, following her into the kitchen. "Actually, I have something for you." He pulled out the emerald earrings, watching her face carefully as she opened the velvet box. Her smile was perfect, surprised, delighted, grateful. If he hadn't witnessed her performance with Sebastian, he might have believed it was genuine. "They're beautiful, Tobias." "Thank you." She stood on her toes to kiss his cheek, the same perfunctory gesture she'd given him for months. "You're so thoughtful." The word thoughtful hung in the air between them. Thoughtful, like a reliable friend or a considerate business partner, not like a husband she loved or desired or respected. "I try to be," he said quietly, "though I'm starting to wonder if thoughtful is enough anymore." Something flickered in Aveline's eyes, not guilt, but calculation. She was assessing the situation, trying to determine if his words carried hidden meaning. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean we barely talk anymore. When was the last time we had dinner together without your phone buzzing every 5 minutes? When did we last have a conversation that wasn't about your clients or my projects?" Aveline set the earrings on the counter and turned to face him fully. "We're both busy, successful people. That's what attracted us to each other in the first place. I thought you understood that." "I understood ambition. I didn't understand indifference." "Indifference?" Her voice sharpened slightly. "I'm not indifferent, Tobias. I'm focused. There's a difference. Focused on what? Because it doesn't seem to include our marriage." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, but he was past caring about diplomacy. 3 years of walking on eggshells, of accepting scraps of attention, of pretending their relationship was normal when it was anything but. All of it crystallized into this moment. Aveline's expression hardened. "I see. So this is about attention? You want me to fawn over you like some desperate housewife? That's not who I am, and you knew that when you married me. I knew you were independent. I didn't know you were incapable of intimacy." "Intimacy?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "We have intimacy. We share a home, a social circle, a lifestyle. We support each other's careers. What more do you want?" "I want a wife who actually wants to be married to me." The words hung between them like a challenge. For a moment, Aveline's mask slipped, and he saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. She was deciding how much truth to reveal, how much of her real self to show him. "You want honesty, Tobias? Fine, here's honesty." She leaned against the kitchen island, her posture relaxed but her voice sharp. "You're a good man, reliable, successful, stable. You provide security and status, and you don't make unreasonable demands. But you're also predictable, safe, and I've never been attracted to safe." The admission should have destroyed him, but instead, it felt like a key turning in a lock. Finally, the truth. "So why did you marry me?" "Because marriage isn't about attraction. It's about partnership, mutual benefit, building something together. We look good together, Tobias. We make sense on paper. Isn't that enough?" "No," he said quietly. "It's not." Aveline studied him for a long moment, and he could see her recalibrating, trying to determine how much damage control was needed. Look, if you want more romance, we can work on that. Schedule date nights, take more trips together. I'm not unreasonable. Schedule romance, like a business meeting or a dental appointment. The offer was almost insulting in its clinical detachment. What about love, Aveline? What about actually caring about each other? I do care about you. In my way. Your way involves lying to me about where you spend your weekends. The words slipped out before he could stop them, and he saw Aveline's eyes narrow slightly. She was trying to determine how much he knew, how much damage had been done. I don't know what you're talking about. Key Largo. Last weekend. The client emergency that required your immediate attention, that was real, Tobias. Mrs. Patterson's son was arrested for… Stop. The word came out harder than he'd intended. Just stop lying to me. They stared at each other across the kitchen island, the pretense finally cracking. Aveline's expression shifted from defensive to something colder, more honest. Fine. You want the truth? Here it is. She straightened, her voice taking on the same dismissive tone he'd heard during her video call. You're replaceable, Tobias. Never forget that. There are a dozen men in this city who could give me everything you do, and most of them would be grateful for the privilege. The words hit him like a physical blow, but they also brought clarity. This was who she really was. Not the woman he'd fallen in love with, but the person she'd always been underneath the carefully constructed facade. And in that moment, Tobias made his choice. The silence that followed Aveline's declaration stretched between them like a chasm. Tobias felt something fundamental shift inside him. Not heartbreak, but liberation. The woman standing across from him had just revealed her true nature, and for the first time in years, he saw their relationship with perfect clarity. You're right, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening in his chest. I am replaceable. But so are you. Aveline's confident expression faltered slightly. She'd expected anger, pleading, perhaps even violence. She hadn't expected calm acceptance. What's that supposed to mean? It means this conversation is over. Tobias turned and walked toward his home office, leaving Aveline standing in the kitchen with her mouth slightly open. Where are you going? We're not finished talking. Yes, we are. He closed the office door behind him and moved directly to the wall safe hidden behind a framed photograph of the Miami skyline, a picture taken the day he'd closed his first major deal. His hands were steady as he entered the combination, muscle memory guiding him through the familiar sequence. Inside the safe, beneath important documents and emergency cash, lay a manila folder he'd hoped never to use. The divorce papers his attorney had prepared 18 months ago, when Tobias first began to suspect his marriage was beyond repair. He'd filed them away, telling himself he was being paranoid, that love and patience could fix anything. He'd been wrong. The papers were comprehensive, detailed, and devastating. His attorney, David Kellerman, was one of Miami's most ruthless divorce lawyers, and he'd crafted a document that would protect every asset Tobias had built before and during his marriage. Prenuptial agreements, business valuations, property assessments, everything was documented with surgical precision. Tobias signed his name with the same steady hand he'd used to close billion-dollar deals. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Just the decisive action of a man who'd finally stopped lying to himself. His phone buzzed with a text from his head of security. Marcus Rivera, Sir, you're back early. Do you need anything? Tobias typed back quickly. Yes. I need you at the penthouse in 1 hour. Bring the team. We have a situation to handle. Understood, sir. How many men? 4 should be sufficient. Discreet, but thorough. On our way. Next he called David Kellerman's direct line. The attorney answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and professional despite the late hour. Tobias, what can I do for you? File the papers, David. Tonight. A pause. Are you certain? Once we file, there's no going back. The media will have the story within hours. I'm certain. How quickly can you move? I can have them filed electronically within the hour. Process servers can be at your penthouse by morning to serve Aveline officially. Do it. And David, activate all the financial protections we discussed. Freeze her access to the joint accounts, credit cards, everything. As of tonight, she's financially cut off. Consider it done. Tobias, Are you somewhere safe? These situations can become volatile quickly. I'm handling it. Just make sure everything is legally bulletproof. It will be. I'll call you when the filing is complete. Tobias ended the call and sat back in his leather chair, staring at the signed divorce papers. 3 years of marriage, 5 years of relationship, reduced to legal documents and financial calculations. It should have felt tragic, but instead, it felt like finally exhaling after holding his breath for years. A soft knock on the office door interrupted his thoughts. Tobias? Aveline's voice was different now, softer, more uncertain. Can we talk? I think there's been a misunderstanding. He opened the door to find her standing in the hallway, still wearing the silk robe, but now with a vulnerable expression that might have fooled him a year ago. She'd had time to think, to realize that her brutal honesty might have consequences. There's no misunderstanding, Eveline. You were perfectly clear. I was angry. I said things I didn't mean. She stepped closer, her hand reaching for his arm. We can work through this. Marriage is about forgiveness, right? The touch that had once sent electricity through him now felt cold, calculated. Even her attempt at reconciliation was a performance. Forgiveness requires remorse. Do you feel remorse, Aveline? She hesitated just long enough to reveal the truth. Of course I do. I hate that I hurt you. You hate that you got caught. There's a difference. Her mask slipped again, revealing a flash of irritation. Fine. So I made some mistakes. So did you. We can both do better. What mistakes did I make? You stopped trying. You got comfortable, complacent. You took me for granted. The accusation was so absurd, it was almost funny. Tobias had spent 3 years bending over backward to please a woman who saw his efforts as weakness and his love as obligation. I see. So your affair is my fault? I never said. She stopped, realizing she'd just confirmed what he already knew. How did you? It doesn't matter how I know. What matters is that it's over. The elevator chimed in the distance, followed by the sound of multiple footsteps in the foyer. Marcus Rivera's voice carried down the hallway. Mr. Creed, we're here as requested. Aveline's eyes widened as she processed the implications. What's going on? Who are those people? Security. They're here to escort you out. Out? This is my home too. Actually, it's not. Check the deed. This penthouse is in my name only, purchased before our marriage. You have no legal claim to it. Marcus appeared at the end of the hallway with 3 other security personnel, all professional, discreet, and completely loyal to Tobias. They'd handled sensitive situations before, always with the utmost professionalism. Mrs. Creed, Marcus said politely, we're here to assist you in gathering your personal belongings. You have 1 hour to pack what you need. The rest can be collected later through your attorney. You can't do this. Aveline's composure finally cracked completely. You can't just throw me out like some common criminal. I'm not throwing you out, Tobias said calmly. I'm ending our marriage. The divorce papers will be served officially tomorrow morning, but as of tonight, you no longer live here. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my concern anymore. You made it very clear that I'm replaceable. Consider this your replacement. Aveline stared at him for a long moment, perhaps finally understanding that her words had consequences. Then her expression hardened into something ugly and vindictive. You'll regret this, Tobias. I'll take you for everything you're worth. Good luck with that. My attorney is very thorough. As Marcus and his team escorted a protesting Aveline to the master bedroom to pack, Tobias returned to his office and poured himself a glass of whiskey. His phone buzzed with a text from David, papers filed. It's done. For the first time in years, Tobias smiled genuinely. It was done indeed. 3 weeks after Aveline's dramatic exit from the penthouse, Tobias found himself standing on the balcony of a modest beachfront cottage in Key Biscayne, watching the sunrise paint the Atlantic in shades of gold and coral. The contrast to his usual morning routine, checking stock prices and construction schedules from his glass tower in downtown Miami, was jarring but necessary. The media frenzy following their divorce filing had been brutal but brief. Miami power couple splits, CEO Creed files for divorce, the end of a dynasty. The headlines had dominated South Florida society pages for exactly 1 news cycle before moving on to fresher scandals. Aveline had tried to control the narrative, giving carefully crafted interviews about growing apart and mutual respect, but the prenuptial agreement left her with limited leverage and even less sympathy. Tobias had weathered the storm by disappearing entirely. He'd left his business in the capable hands of his executive team and rented this cottage for an indefinite period, telling only his closest associates where he'd gone. No social media, no public appearances, no carefully orchestrated image management, just silence and space to breathe. The cottage was everything his penthouse wasn't: small, weathered, authentic. Built in the 1960s by a fisherman who'd wanted to be close to the water, it had been lovingly maintained by 3 generations of the same family. The furniture was comfortable rather than designer, the kitchen functional rather than showcase, worthy, the view spectacular rather than strategically positioned for maximum status impact. For the first time in years, Tobias woke up without an agenda. The first week had been difficult. His body was accustomed to constant motion, his mind trained to solve problems and close deals. Without the familiar rhythms of corporate life, he felt adrift, purposeless. He'd tried reading business journals, but the articles felt hollow. He'd attempted to review architectural plans for future projects, but couldn't summon the enthusiasm that had once driven him. By the second week, something shifted. He began taking long walks on the beach, letting the rhythm of the waves replace the urgency of conference calls. He cooked simple meals instead of ordering from expensive restaurants. He watched sunsets without photographing them for social media. Slowly, the constant tension in his shoulders began to ease. The third week brought a routine of sorts: morning coffee on the deck, afternoon walks, evening reading. He'd discovered a small cafe called Sunrise about half a mile down the beach road, a local institution that served the best Cuban coffee in Key Biscayne and attracted an eclectic mix of fishermen, retirees and young professionals who'd escaped the mainland for a slower pace of life. It was there, on a Thursday morning that felt like any other, that he first noticed her. She was behind the counter, moving with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in her environment. Dark curls escaped from a messy bun secured with what appeared to be a pencil, and her sundress was simple cotton rather than designer silk. She laughed at something an elderly customer said, the sound genuine and unguarded, so different from the calculated charm Tobias had grown accustomed to in his social circle. "First time here?" she asked when he approached the counter, her brown eyes warm and curious rather than calculating. "Third, actually. But I usually come later in the day." "Ah, you're the mysterious cottage renter. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned someone was staying at the old Fernandez place." She smiled, extending a flour-dusted hand. "I'm Mariel Santos. Welcome to our little corner of paradise." "Tobias." He shook her hand, noting the calluses that spoke of real work rather than manicured perfection. "And thank you. It's exactly what I needed. Running away from something or running toward something?" The question was asked lightly, without judgment, but it hit closer to home than she could have known. "Both, I think." Mariel nodded as if this made perfect sense. The best escapes usually are. "What can I get you?" He ordered a cortadito and a guava pastry, watching as she moved efficiently behind the counter. There was something soothing about her presence. No performance, no agenda, just genuine warmth and competence. "You're not from around here," she observed, preparing his coffee with practiced ease. "Miami, downtown." "Ah, the big city. What brings you to our sleepy island?" "Divorce," he said, surprising himself with his honesty. He'd been deflecting questions about his personal life for weeks, but something about Mariel's straightforward manner invited truth. "Ouch. Recent?" "Very." She handed him his coffee, their fingers brushing briefly. "Well, you picked the right place to heal. Key Biscayne has a way of putting things in perspective." "How so?" "The ocean doesn't care about your problems. The sunrise happens whether you're watching or not. The pelicans fish, whether you're successful or broke. There's something humbling about being reminded that the world is bigger than whatever's happening in your head." It was the most profound thing anyone had said to him in months, delivered without pretension or self-consciousness. Mariel wasn't trying to impress him or fix him. She was simply sharing an observation born from experience. "Sounds like you speak from experience." "Don't we all? Life has a way of humbling everyone eventually." She wiped down the counter, her movements economical and purposeful. The trick is learning to find peace in the humbling instead of fighting it. Tobias sipped his coffee, perfectly balanced, rich without being bitter, and studied this woman who seemed so comfortable with herself and her place in the world. She was probably in her early 30s, with laugh lines around her eyes and a tan that spoke of time spent outdoors, rather than expensive spa treatments. "What's your story?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Born here, left for college in Gainesville, came back after my dad had his heart attack 5 years ago. Took over the cafe, never left again." She shrugged, as if this simple narrative contained all the complexity anyone needed. Some people are meant to explore the world. Others are meant to create a place worth coming home to. And you're the latter? Definitely. Though I've learned that home can be a state of mind as much as a physical place. The cafe door chimed as another customer entered, a weathered man in fishing gear who greeted Mariel like family. She excused herself to take his order, leaving Tobias to contemplate her words. Home as a state of mind. For years he'd thought home was the penthouse, the status, the carefully curated life he'd built with Eveline. But sitting in this simple cafe, watching Mariel interact with her customers like they were old friends, he realized he'd never felt at home in his own life. He finished his coffee slowly, reluctant to leave the warmth of the cafe for the solitude of the cottage. When Mariel returned to his section of the counter, she refilled his cup without being asked. "On the house," she said when he reached for his wallet. "First time morning customer special, thank you. For the coffee and the conversation, anytime. That's what we're here for." As Tobias walked back to the cottage, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow morning in a way he hadn't anticipated anything in months. Not because he was attracted to Mariel, though he was, but because she'd reminded him what genuine human connection felt like. For the first time since his marriage ended, he felt something other than relief or anger. He felt hope. The morning visits to Sunrise Cafe became the anchor of Tobias's days. What started as a simple coffee run evolved into something more meaningful. Conversations that stretched beyond polite small talk into territory he hadn't explored in years. Mariel had a gift for asking questions that mattered, without making them feel like an interrogation. "You seem lighter today," she observed on his second week of morning visits, sliding a fresh cortadito across the counter. "Less like you're carrying the weight of the world." Tobias considered this, surprised by her perceptiveness. "I think I'm starting to remember what it feels like to breathe. Good. Breathing is underrated." She leaned against the counter, giving him her full attention, despite the cafe's busy morning rush. "What did you do before you forgot how to breathe?" "Real estate development, luxury resorts, high-end residential projects. I built things." Past tense. Present tense, I suppose. "I'm just taking a break from it." "What kind of things do you build?" The question was simple, but it opened something in Tobias that had been closed for years. He found himself describing his projects not in terms of profit margins and market positioning, but in terms of vision and craftsmanship. The way morning light would filter through the lobby of the Meridian Towers. The satisfaction of transforming abandoned lots into spaces where families would build memories. Mariel listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about architectural challenges and design philosophy. She didn't seem impressed by the scale or cost of his projects. She was interested in the creative process, the problem-solving, the human element of creating spaces where people would live and work and love. "You light up when you talk about the actual building," she said when he paused. "But you sound tired when you mention the business side. The business pays for the building." "True. But which part feeds your soul?" The question caught him off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked about his soul? Eveline had been interested in his success, his status, his ability to provide a certain lifestyle. But his soul? That had never been part of the equation. "I used to love the design phase," he admitted. "Working with architects, solving structural problems, figuring out how to make something beautiful and functional. But somewhere along the way, it became more about the deal than the dream. Maybe that's what you need to get back to." The dream part. Their conversations weren't limited to his work. Mariel shared stories about growing up on Key Biscayne, about her father's fishing boat and her mother's garden, about the hurricane that had nearly destroyed the cafe when she was in college. She spoke about her decision to return home not as a failure to launch, but as a conscious choice to build something meaningful in a place she loved. People think small-town life is limiting, she said one morning while preparing his usual order. But I think it's liberating. When you're not constantly chasing the next big thing, you can actually appreciate what you have. Don't you ever want more? More what? More money? More recognition? More stuff? She shrugged, handing him his coffee. I have work that matters to me, people I care about, a place I love. What more is there? The simplicity of her contentment was both inspiring and challenging. Tobias had spent his entire adult life accumulating more wealth, more properties, more status. But sitting in this modest cafe, talking to a woman who measured success in terms of community and connection rather than net worth, he began to question what more actually meant. As the days passed, their conversations deepened. Mariel shared her struggles with taking over the family business, the pressure of keeping a local institution alive in an increasingly corporate world. Tobias found himself offering advice not as a successful businessman, but as someone who understood the weight of responsibility and the fear of failure. You're a good listener, she said one afternoon, when the lunch rush had died down, and they had the cafe mostly to themselves. That's rarer than you might think. I'm out of practice. My ex-wife wasn't much for conversation. It was the first time he'd mentioned Eveline directly, and Mariel's expression grew thoughtful. Want to talk about it? Not much to say. We wanted different things. Took me longer than it should have to realize that. What did you want? Partnership, connection, someone who saw me as more than a provider or a status symbol. The words came out more honestly than he'd intended. What did she want? Everything I couldn't give her while still being myself. Mariel nodded as if this made perfect sense. Some people love the idea of you more than they love you. It's not personal, but it hurts just the same. The insight was so accurate, it took his breath away. Eveline had loved the idea of being married to a successful developer, but she'd never loved Tobias, himself, his quirks, his vulnerabilities, his dreams beyond what they could do for her image. How do you know when someone loves you versus loving what you represent? He asked. They see you when you're not performing. They're interested in your thoughts, not just your achievements. They make space for your flaws instead of trying to fix them. Mariel paused, wiping down the counter with more attention than it required. They choose you on your worst days, not just your best ones. The conversation stayed with Tobias long after he'd returned to the cottage. That evening, sitting on the deck with a beer and watching fishing, boats returned to harbor, he realized something profound had shifted. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Not as CEO Tobias Creed, not as Eveline's husband, not as a successful businessman, but as himself. Mariel didn't know about his wealth or his social status. She knew him as the guy who rented the cottage, who was healing from a divorce, who lit up when talking about architecture and grew quiet when discussing business deals. She liked that version of him, the unguarded, unperformed version he'd almost forgotten existed. The next morning he arrived at the cafe to find Mariel struggling with a broken espresso machine, her usual calm demeanor replaced by frustrated determination. Can I help? He offered. Unless you're secretly a barista mechanic, probably not. But thanks. Tobias rolled up his sleeves and examined the machine. Years of construction work had taught him to troubleshoot mechanical problems, and within 20 minutes, he'd identified and fixed the issue, a clogged valve that had been causing pressure problems. How did you? Mariel stared at the now functioning machine in amazement. I used to work construction summers during college. You learn to fix things. She looked at him with new appreciation, but not the calculating kind he was used to. This was genuine gratitude mixed with pleasant surprise. Thank you. You just saved my morning rush. Happy to help. And he was. For the first time in years, helping someone felt natural rather than obligatory, generous rather than strategic. The shift happened gradually, like sunrise over the ocean, so subtle at first that Tobias almost missed it. What began as morning coffee conversations evolved into afternoon walks along the beach, then evening dinners at the small restaurants Mariel recommended. She introduced him to Key Biscayne through local eyes, the hidden coves where manatees gathered, the family-owned markets where 3 generations worked side by side, the sunset spots that tourists never discovered. You're different from what I expected, Mariel said one evening as they sat on the seawall watching pelicans dive for fish. They'd been spending time together for nearly a month, and their friendship had deepened into something neither of them had named yet. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone more polished, I guess. More corporate. You mentioned you were from downtown Miami, and I pictured suits and power lunches and people who check their phones every 30 seconds. Tobias laughed, remembering his old life with something approaching fondness rather than bitterness. That was me, actually. 6 months ago, you would have been exactly right. What changed? I stopped pretending to be someone I wasn't. The honesty surprised them both. Tobias had been carefully guarded for so long that vulnerability felt foreign, dangerous. But with Marielle, truth felt safer than performance. Who were you pretending to be? The perfect husband, the successful businessman who had it all figured out, the man who could make everyone happy if he just worked hard enough, and earned enough, and achieved enough. He picked up a piece of driftwood, turning it over in his hands. Turns out, you can't earn love. You can only receive it or not. Marielle was quiet for a long moment, watching the waves roll in with hypnotic regularity. My ex-fiancé used to say I wasn't ambitious enough, that I was wasting my potential running a small cafe instead of building an empire. You were engaged 3 years ago. David was a lawyer from Miami, successful, driven, everything my parents thought I should want. He proposed on Christmas Eve in front of my entire family, this big romantic gesture with a ring that cost more than the cafe makes in 6 months. What happened? I said yes because I thought I should. Because he looked perfect on paper and everyone expected it to work. She smiled ruefully. But perfect on paper isn't the same as perfect for you. When did you realize that? When he started planning our wedding like a corporate merger. Guest lists based on networking potential. Venues chosen for their social media appeal. Everything designed to advance his career. I kept waiting for him to ask what I wanted, but he never did. He'd already decided who I should be as his wife. The parallel to his own marriage was so obvious it made Tobias's chest tighten. So you called it off? 2 weeks before the wedding. Hardest thing I'd ever done, but also the most honest. She turned to look at him directly. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is disappoint people who love the wrong version of you. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Tobias felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the peace of being. Completely accepted as he was, without performance or pretense. Can I ask you something? Marielle's voice was soft, tentative. Anything. What was she like? Your ex-wife? Tobias considered the question carefully. For weeks he'd avoided talking about Aveline in detail, but Marielle's openness about her own past made him want to reciprocate. Beautiful, brilliant, ambitious, everything I thought I wanted. He paused, searching for the right words. But she saw me as a project to be managed, rather than a person to be loved. I spent 5 years trying to be good enough for someone who was fundamentally incapable of seeing my worth. That must have been exhausting. It was. I lost myself trying to become what she wanted. And the irony is, she never wanted me at all. She wanted what I represented. The lifestyle, the status, the image of success. Do you miss her? I miss who I thought she was. I miss the marriage I thought we had. But the real Evelyn? The woman who could look me in the eye and tell me I was replaceable? He shook his head. No, I don't miss being invisible in my own life. Marielle reached over and took his hand, her fingers warm and calloused from real work. The gesture was simple, undemanding, but it sent electricity through him that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with human connection. You're not invisible, she said quietly. Not to me. The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Tobias looked at this woman who had somehow become essential to his days, not because she needed him or wanted something from him, but because she saw him, the real him, stripped of wealth and status and carefully constructed image. Marielle, he began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what he was feeling. I know, she said softly. I feel it too. I don't want to rush anything. I'm still figuring out who I am outside of my marriage. I'm not going anywhere. We have time. Time. Such a simple concept, but one that had been foreign to his relationship with Evelyn. Everything with her had been urgent, strategic, performed for an audience. With Marielle, there was space to breathe, to discover, to simply be. That night, Walking back to his cottage under a canopy of stars, Tobias realized he was falling in love. Not the desperate, grasping love he'd felt for Aveline, the kind that demanded constant proof and validation. This was something quieter, steadier, built on foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. Mariel didn't need him to be successful, or wealthy, or impressive. She liked him for his curiosity, his kindness, his willingness to help fix a broken espresso machine without being asked. She laughed at his stories not because they enhanced her social status, but because she found them genuinely funny. For the first time in his adult life, Tobias felt loved for who he was rather than what he could provide. The feeling was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it required him to believe he was worthy of love without earning it. Liberating because it freed him from the exhausting performance of trying to be enough for someone who would never be satisfied. As he fell asleep to the sound of waves outside his window, Tobias smiled. Tomorrow he would see Mariel again, and the day after that, and the day after that. Not because he had to, not because it served some strategic purpose, but because being with her felt like coming home to himself. 6 months into his new life in Key Biscayne, Tobias had almost forgotten what it felt like to live in constant tension. His days had found a rhythm: morning coffee with Mariel, afternoon work on his laptop, reviewing architectural plans his team sent from Miami, evening walks on the beach. The cottage had become more than a retreat. It had become home in a way the penthouse never was. He was reviewing blueprints for a sustainable housing project in Fort Lauderdale when his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown Miami number. He almost ignored it. Most business calls went through his assistant, but something made him answer. Tobias. Aveline's voice was different from the last time he'd heard it. Softer, more vulnerable, stripped of the commanding confidence that had once defined her. Aveline. He set down his pen, his body automatically tensing despite months of peace. What do you want? To talk, to explain, to apologize. A pause, then a sound that might have been a sob. I've made terrible mistakes, and I need you to know how sorry I am. The performance was masterful, just the right amount of remorse mixed with hope, delivered with the emotional precision that had made her so successful at managing public images. 6 months ago it might have worked, but Tobias had learned to recognize manipulation, and more importantly, he'd learned what genuine emotions sounded like. There's nothing to explain, Aveline. We're divorced. It's over. The papers aren't final yet. We still have time to fix this. I don't want to fix it. Please, just give me one conversation, one chance to show you how much I've changed. Her voice cracked with what sounded like desperation. I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago. Against his better judgment, Tobias found himself curious about what had prompted this call. Aveline had never been one to admit weakness or seek forgiveness. Something significant must have happened to crack her armor. One conversation, he said finally, but not here. Meet me at the Ritz-Carlton in Coconut Grove tomorrow at 2. The lobby bar. Thank you. Tobias, you won't regret this. But as he hung up, he already did. The next afternoon, Tobias arrived at the Ritz-Carlton 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table with clear sightlines to all entrances. Old habits from his corporate days: never let anyone approach without seeing them coming. He ordered a whiskey and waited, watching Miami's elite conduct their usual business of being seen and photographed. Aveline arrived precisely on time, and Tobias had to admit she looked stunning. Her hair was shorter, more natural, and she wore a simple black dress that suggested elegance without screaming for attention. But it was her eyes that caught him. They held a vulnerability he'd never seen before, as if some fundamental confidence had been shaken. You look good, she said, sliding into the chair across from him. Relaxed, happy. I am. She ordered a glass of white wine, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted it to her lips. I suppose you're wondering why I called. The thought had occurred to me. Sebastian left me. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for weeks. 3 months ago. He said I was too high maintenance, too demanding. Can you believe that? Tobias could absolutely believe it, but he kept his expression neutral. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? Really? Her eyes searched his face for any sign of satisfaction or vindication. Because I know you have every right to hate me. I don't hate you, Aveline. I don't feel anything about you anymore. The honesty hit her like a physical blow. She'd expected anger, hurt, even lingering love. Indifference was worse than any of those. "I've been seeing a therapist," she continued, her voice smaller now. "Dr. Martinez. She's helped me understand some things about myself, about why I sabotage good relationships." "That's good. I hope it helps you." "She says I have abandonment issues stemming from my father leaving when I was 12, that I push people away before they can leave me." Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes bright, with the fervor of someone who'd found a new truth. "I pushed you away because I was afraid of how much I needed you." The explanation was textbook psychology, delivered with the same precision Aveline brought to all her performances. But Tobias had spent 6 months learning the difference between genuine emotion and calculated presentation. "Maybe that's true," he said quietly. "But it doesn't change what happened. It doesn't erase the cruelty or the betrayal or the years of emotional manipulation. I know I hurt you terribly. But people can change, Tobias. I'm changing. I'm learning to be vulnerable, to trust, to love without conditions. I'm glad for you. But that doesn't mean we belong together. Why not? We were good together once. We could be good again. We were never good together, Aveline. We were good at performing together. There's a difference." She flinched as if he'd slapped her. "That's not true. We had real moments, real connection." "Name one." The challenge hung between them. Aveline opened her mouth, then closed it, her face cycling through emotions, as she searched her memory for genuine intimacy rather than staged romance. "Our wedding night," she said finally, "when we talked about our dreams for the future. You talked about your 5-year plan for expanding your business. I listened. The trip to Santorini. We were so happy. You spent half the time on conference calls and the other half posing for photos." Each memory she offered, he gently corrected with the truth. Not cruelly, but honestly. And with each correction, he watched her realize that their entire relationship had been built on performance rather than connection. "There must have been something real," she whispered, tears finally spilling over. 5 years can't have been completely fake. The feelings were real. My love for you was real. But the relationship itself, the partnership, that was always one-sided. Aveline sat back in her chair, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking completely. "So that's it? You won't even consider trying again?" "I'm with someone else now." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Who?" "Someone who sees me as a person rather than a project. Someone who loves me for who I am, not what I can provide." Is she rich, successful, beautiful? The questions revealed everything about how Aveline measured worth. "She's kind, she's genuine. She makes me laugh. She makes me feel like myself. That's not enough to build a life on. It's everything to build a life on." Aveline stared at him for a long moment, perhaps finally understanding that. The man sitting across from her was not the same person she'd married. The desperate, approval-seeking husband who'd bent himself into impossible shapes to earn her love was gone, replaced by someone who knew his own worth. "I could fight the divorce," she said quietly. "Drag it out, make it expensive and public. You could. But you won't." "Why not?" "Because you're not vindictive, Aveline. You're selfish and manipulative, but you're not cruel for the sake of cruelty. And because fighting would require admitting publicly that you want something you can't have. Your pride won't allow that." She laughed bitterly. "You know me too well. I know the version of you that you showed me. I'm not sure anyone knows the real you." "Maybe not. Maybe that's the problem." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 5 years settling between them. Finally, Aveline reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "The final divorce papers," she said, sliding them across the table. "I signed them this morning." Tobias opened the envelope, scanning the documents quickly. Everything was in order, no last-minute demands, no attempts at manipulation, just a clean end to a relationship that should have ended years earlier. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. "Don't thank me. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because holding on to something that was never real is keeping me from finding something that might be." It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to him. "I hope you find it," Tobias said, standing to leave. "I really do." "Tobias?" Her voice stopped him at the edge of the table. "For what it's worth, I did love you. In my way. I know. But your way wasn't enough for either of us." As he walked away from the table, Tobias felt the final weight of his marriage lift from his shoulders. The papers in his hand represented more than legal freedom. They represented the end of a chapter that had taught him everything about what he didn't want and nothing about what he did. But now he knew, and she was waiting for him in a small cafe in Key Biscayne, probably wondering why he was late for their evening walk. 8 months after signing the final divorce papers, Tobias found himself standing in the kitchen of a restored Victorian house in Savannah's historic district, watching Marielle arrange fresh flowers from the garden they'd planted together. The morning light filtered through lace curtains, casting gentle shadows across hardwood floors that creaked with character rather than age. "The azaleas are blooming early this year," Marielle said, adjusting a spray of pink blossoms in a mason jar. "Mrs. Chen next door says it's because we've been talking to them." "You've been talking to them," Tobias corrected, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. "I just water them and try not to kill them." Same thing. Plants respond to attention, not just technique. It was such a Marielle thing to say, finding deeper meaning in simple acts, seeing connection where others saw only maintenance. In the year since they'd moved to Savannah together, Tobias had learned to see the world through her eyes, finding richness in moments he would have previously overlooked. The decision to leave Florida had been mutual but not immediate. After the divorce was finalized, Tobias had returned to Miami briefly to wrap up business affairs and transition his company to a more hands-off role. Marielle had visited him there once, spending a weekend in his penthouse that felt like a museum compared to the warmth of her cafe. "It's beautiful," she'd said, standing on the balcony overlooking Biscayne Bay. "But it doesn't feel like you." "What feels like me?" "The cottage, the way you look when you're fixing something with your hands, the way you laugh when we're walking on the beach and no one's watching." That conversation had planted the seed that eventually grew into their move to Savannah. Marielle had always dreamed of opening a bookstore cafe, and Tobias had fallen in love with the city's architecture during a weekend visit. When a perfect property became available, a 1890s house with commercial space on the ground floor and living quarters above, they'd made the leap together. Pages and Pour had opened 6 months ago, combining Marielle's love of literature with her gift for creating community spaces. The cafe occupied the front rooms of the house, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lining the walls and comfortable reading nooks tucked into bay windows. The back garden served as an outdoor seating area, where customers could enjoy their coffee surrounded by the herbs and flowers Marielle cultivated with the same care she brought to everything else. Tobias had thrown himself into the renovation with an enthusiasm that surprised them both. After years of managing construction from boardrooms, he'd rediscovered the satisfaction of physical work, stripping, paint, refinishing floors, installing custom shelving designed to showcase both books and local art. His hands, soft from years of desk work, had developed calluses again. "You're different when you're building something," Marielle had observed one evening, finding him still working by lamplight to install the cafe's custom counter. "More yourself. I forgot how much I missed it. The actual creating, not just the managing. Maybe that's what you needed to remember." The bookstore cafe had become exactly what Marielle had envisioned, a gathering place for Savannah's eclectic mix of artists, students, retirees, and young families. Tobias had worried initially about the financial viability, his business mind calculating profit margins and overhead costs. But Marielle had taught him that success could be measured in ways that didn't appear on balance sheets. "Mrs. Patterson brings her granddaughter here every Tuesday for story time," she'd said one afternoon, watching an elderly woman read to a wide-eyed 4-year-old in the children's corner. "That little girl is going to remember this place her whole life. How do you put a price on that?" Their relationship had deepened in ways Tobias hadn't known were possible. Unlike his marriage to Aveline, which had been built on performance and mutual benefit, his partnership with Marielle was founded on genuine compatibility and shared values. They worked together seamlessly, whether renovating the house or running the business, each complementing the other's strengths without trying to change their fundamental nature. "You don't try to fix me," Marielle had said one night as they sat on their front porch, watching fireflies dance in the garden. "That's new for me. What's to fix? You're perfect as you are. I'm not perfect. I'm stubborn and overly sentimental, and I cry at commercials. David used to make lists of ways I could improve myself. David was an idiot, maybe, but he wasn't wrong about everything. I could be more ambitious, more focused on success. Success according to who? You've created something beautiful here. You've built a business that brings joy to people every day. You've made a home that feels like sanctuary. If that's not success, I don't know what is. The conversation had crystallized something important for both of them. They weren't trying to become different people for each other. They were becoming better versions of themselves because they felt safe to be vulnerable, to grow, to make mistakes without judgment. Their physical relationship had evolved with the same natural progression as their emotional connection. Unlike the scheduled intimacy of his marriage, passion with Mariel felt spontaneous and genuine. She didn't use sex as a reward or withhold it as punishment. It was simply another way they connected, as natural as their morning conversations, over coffee or their evening walks through Savannah's historic squares. "I love how you touch me," she'd whispered one night, her head resting on his chest as rain drummed against their bedroom windows. "Like you're grateful to be here. I am grateful, every day, even when I leave coffee rings on your architectural drawings. Especially then. It means you're real, that this is real." The business had grown steadily, attracting customers who came for the coffee, but stayed for the atmosphere. Tobias had used his connections to bring in local artists for monthly exhibitions, turning the cafe into an unofficial cultural center. Muriel had started a book club that met weekly, fostering discussions that ranged from literature to philosophy to local politics. "We're building something that matters," she'd said one evening as they closed up, surveying the cafe filled with the comfortable chaos of a day well lived, books left open on tables, coffee cups bearing lipstick marks, children's drawings taped to the refrigerator. "We are," Tobias had agreed, understanding for the first time what it meant to create something larger than profit or personal gain. Standing in their kitchen now, watching Mariel arrange flowers with the same attention she brought to everything in their shared life, Tobias felt a contentment he'd never experienced before. This wasn't the desperate happiness of trying to make something work, it was the quiet satisfaction of something that worked naturally, effortlessly, because it was built on the right foundation. "What are you thinking about?" Mariel asked, catching his reflection in the window. "How lucky I am. We both are," and they were, not because their life was perfect, but because it was real. 2 years after leaving Miami, Tobias stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Georgia's Business School, preparing to deliver a lecture he never thought he'd give. The invitation had come through a former colleague who'd heard about his unconventional career transition and thought his story might inspire students facing their own crossroads. "Success isn't always what it looks like from the outside," he began, looking out at the sea of eager faces. "I spent 15 years building what everyone else considered the perfect life, wealth, status, recognition, but I was miserable. And it took losing everything I thought mattered to discover what actually did." The students leaned forward, expecting a typical rags to riches narrative. Instead, Tobias shared something more complex, the story of a man who'd had to learn the difference between achievement and fulfillment, between being wanted and being loved. "I married a woman who saw me as a project to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. For 5 years, I tried to earn her love by becoming someone I wasn't. I changed my clothes, my friends, my interests, even my personality. And none of it worked, because you can't earn genuine love. You can only receive it or not." He told them about the night Eveline had looked him in the eye and called him replaceable, about the moment he'd realized that trying to be enough for someone who would never be satisfied was slowly killing the person he actually was. "The hardest lesson I learned was that self-worth isn't negotiable. If someone makes you feel like you have to prove your value constantly, they're not the right person for you. Love shouldn't be a performance review." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "But how do you know the difference between someone who challenges you to grow and someone who's trying to change who you are?" "Growth feels like expansion," Tobias replied. "Change feels like erasure. Someone who loves you will encourage you to become the best version of yourself. Someone who wants to control you will try to make you into their version of who you should be." He shared the story of meeting Mariel, of learning what it felt like to be accepted completely, flaws, quirks, and all. He talked about the cafe they'd built together, about finding purpose in creating something that brought joy to others rather than just profit to himself. "I'm not saying money doesn't matter or that ambition is wrong, but when external validation becomes your primary source of self-worth, You're building your life on a foundation that can crumble at any moment. True confidence comes from knowing who you are when no one's watching, when there's no audience to impress. After the lecture, students lingered to ask questions. A young man named Marcus approached, his expression troubled. "Mr. Creed, what if you're already in a relationship that feels like what you described? What if you love someone but they make you feel like you're never enough?" Tobias recognized the pain in the student's eyes, the same desperate confusion he'd felt for years with Evelyn. "That's not love," he said gently. "That's addiction. You're addicted to the hope that if you just try harder, change more, achieve more, they'll finally see your worth. But people who truly love you already see it. But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm just being too sensitive? Trust your instincts. If you feel like you're constantly walking on eggshells, if you find yourself changing fundamental parts of who you are to avoid conflict, if you feel more anxious than happy in the relationship, those are signs. Love should feel like coming home, not like auditioning for a part you'll never get." The conversation reminded Tobias of his own journey, of how long it had taken him to trust his instincts over his desperate desire to make his marriage work. He thought about the therapy sessions he'd attended after the divorce, learning to recognize the patterns that had made him vulnerable to emotional manipulation. "I spent years thinking that if I could just be successful enough, wealthy enough, perfect enough, I could earn the love I craved," he told the student. "But the only person whose approval you need is your own. When you know your worth, you won't accept treatment that suggests otherwise." Driving back to Savannah that evening, Tobias reflected on how far he'd traveled, not just geographically, but emotionally. The man who'd stood in that Miami penthouse, devastated by his wife's cruelty, had been broken but not destroyed. That breaking had been necessary, clearing away the false foundations so something real could be built. He arrived home to find Marielle in the garden, reading by the light of string bulbs they'd hung between the oak trees. She looked up as he approached, her smile immediate and genuine. "How did it go?" "Better than expected. I think some of them actually listened." "Of course they did. You have important things to say." She patted the space beside her on the garden bench. "Tell me about it." As he recounted the evening, Tobias marveled at the difference between this conversation and the countless debriefings he'd had with Aveline after business events. Marielle asked questions because she was genuinely interested, not because she was calculating how his success reflected on her. She celebrated his victories without trying to claim credit, supported his struggles without making them about her. "I'm proud of you," she said when he finished, "not just for the lecture, but for being willing to share your story. It takes courage to be that vulnerable in public." "I learned from the best," he said, taking her hand. "You taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the foundation of real connection." They sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the garden they'd planted together, the cafe they'd built together, the life they'd created together. It wasn't perfect. They had disagreements, challenges, moments of doubt like any couple. But it was real in a way Tobias's previous life had never been. "Do you ever regret it?" Marielle asked quietly. "Giving up the penthouse, the status, the corporate success?" "Never. I didn't give up success. I redefined it. Success isn't about having the most impressive life. It's about having a life that's actually yours." As they walked inside together, Tobias thought about the students he'd spoken to, hoping his story might save some of them from the years of self-doubt and emotional starvation he'd endured. The greatest gift he could give them wasn't business advice or networking tips. It was permission to value themselves enough to demand better. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that love can heal, that walking away doesn't mean giving up, and that you are never truly replaceable, please like this video. Drop a comment and tell us the moment that touched your heart the most. And if you believe in second chances, in quiet strength, and in stories that speak to the soul, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment like this. Share this with someone who needs to hear they still matter, someone who's rebuilding, someone who forgot what they're worth. Because it's never too late to start again, to be seen, or to be loved the right way. Thank you for being part of this family. We'll see you in the next story.